Okay, recording started. Welcome to the study hall for September 27th. Critical reasoning today, more assumption problems. This is a continuation of we did one unit on assumption problems a very, very long time ago. I want to say it's either 1.5 years or 2.5 years, but it's been kind of a while. So I'm going to kick that on again. We got to look at rules first, ladies and gentlemen. So here we go with that. Okay. Again, if you are watching this recording or if you are here live, please pay attention because let's just say that the submissions from the last couple of weeks have not really conformed to these guidelines very well. Nothing too general, please. I mean, we have to have something that we can cover in a 1.5-hour study hall and not just like briefly touch on. Like we got to be able to have a decently broad coverage of the topic. So it can't be too general. But this is the big thing that people have been doing lots and lots of in recent editions in recent submissions is too specific. I mean, again, please do not type out a single problem and then ask about one or two answer choices. That's not really what this is for. Like, that's the purpose of the forums, but not this. This is not for individual problems. Because if we did that, we wouldn't have any continuity to the sessions here. So really, guys, if you have one problem and one question about that one problem, please just post it on the forum. Like, not only is that why we have a forum in the first place, but also you will get your answer a lot faster that way too. Because the turnaround time of the forums is usually pretty quick. Also, please don't submit personal issues. Please try to keep in mind that, hundreds of people, in fact, thousands for some of the older recordings are watching these things. So, it wouldn't make sense to discuss like your personal study plan with 1,000 people. On the other hand, we do have a place for this, that we have a folder called General Questions, which is precisely for that kind of thing. Here's where I stand, here's my proposed study plan, and all that kind of thing. And then if it's an admissions question, we also have a folder dedicated to admissions, which is operated by our partner firm, MBA Mission, who specializes in that kind of thing. So, okay, what we need to see is this, again, topics of intermediate depth. Like today's topic, find the assumption in critical reasoning. Not too broad, not too narrow. Like, this is not as broad as I need help with critical reasoning, because, that's not a single topic. But it's also not a single problem. It's a decently medium scope kind of topic. So if you submit a specific problem, then great, but make sure that you, number one, cite the source, and number two, tie that specific question into a more general idea. So if it's just a question and nothing else, we would expect that to go on the forum. So here are some illustrations from the last 2 weeks that are not good submissions. And it's, it looks like some people have actually taken a bunch of time to type these into the window. So guys, please, guidelines first. Like, this person apparently spent a lot of time typing this problem, unless they cut and pasted it or something. But this is a single problem, and this person is asking a single question about a single answer choice. So this kind of question is exactly the reason why we have a forum. So please post it there. Also, this is a submission from the official guide. We've had a bunch of those lately. Like, when you first log into the submissions page, it should say in boldface text, please do not use official guide problems. So to submit something like this, you would have to basically ignore the gigantic warning at the start of the page. But please don't ignore the warning, guys. We can't use these. So, and then this kind of thing, I personally am weak at reading comprehension. I take a lot of time. Number one, this question's too general anyway, because this is kind of asking about all of reading comprehension as a whole. And it's not really a thing that we can do in a study hall. But also, number two, this is one person's individual challenges. And so that would be a better question for the general questions folder on the forum. Or if it's a real sticking point, yeah, perhaps even for private tutoring instruction. So, but this is not really a good study hall topic. Remember, when you first log onto the submission screen, you will see this box right here. This box, by the way, guys, we're not really kidding with this box. Like when we say no official guide problems, that means no official guide problems. Thank you in advance. When we say do not submit extremely specific problems, that's what we mean. We mean please post those on the forum. And I think something about 75 or 80% of our submissions in the last couple of weeks have been things that we could not possibly use because of one or the other of these things. So please pay attention to the guidelines. Thank you very much in advance. If you understand these rules, please click on the smiley face icon. If you don't know where to find that, that would be found on your screen. You should see, let's take the next page here. On your screen, you should see this kind of thing underneath your name. You should see this smiley face icon. So when I say give me a smiley face, that means right there, that sort of smiley face. It doesn't mean put a smiley face in the chat box. I mean, a couple of you are doing that. It's not what it means. It means click on that thing that's next to your name and give me the smiley face there, not the chat box. So there you go. Also, let's just go ahead and get this out of the way. When there's a question that has multiple choice answers to it, make sure that you use you should have just seen this appear in the last few seconds. If you have a multiple choice question, where you're going to find the responses to that will be right here for multiple choice questions. You should see an alphabetical choice here, A, B, C, D, E. If you click this, it should give you a pull down that shows multiple choice answers. Very important, please use these options. Please do not post your answer publicly for everyone else to see. So please don't post in the chat box. If you want to change your answer, all you have to do is just select the new option. Please don't select the same option twice in a row. If you do, it will delete what you have chosen. So this is where that is found. Okay, if you know where to find all these things now, then please give me the smiley face. Again, the smiley face icon, not a smiley face in the chat box. Good stuff. Okay. So also, if you understand these rules and why these examples on the board are not good examples for the study hall, if you understand that, please give me the smiley face as well. Okay. A little bit of tepid participation this time, but let's go ahead and move on. Again, please don't submit things that we can't use because we can't use them. So, all right. Lastly, there are about 70 archives at this point. Like this has been running for over 2 years, every other week-ish. So we have, about 2 or 3 years worth of archives at this point. That's 70-ish, somewhere around 70 sessions. So what that means is that the topic that you submit, it's very likely that a topic you think of has already been covered. If it has, then please watch the video for that topic and see whether your problem is already addressed in the video. So let's go ahead and type this out. Like if you want, like when you come up with a topic, please check the archives for it. If you see your topic in the archives, then watch that video. And then if there are angles that haven't been addressed, then please specify those angles when you submit your problems. This is very, very, very important, ladies and gentlemen. So, because we've had also a lot of people submitting questions that have actually been used in previous study halls. Like we had one person asking about explain the situation or paradox type of questions, but then they submitted 2 problems that we actually used just a couple of months ago for that topic. So please watch the archive recordings first, because you may find, I mean, we've done the better part of 100 of these. So a lot of what you have to submit will be there already. Okay, those are the rules, ladies and gentlemen. If you understand those, then please give me the smiley face. Smiley face, if you understand the rules. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Remember that today's topic, if you just came, today's topic is more assumption questions in critical reasoning. So, and then just to make sure we're all on the same page, again, these are going to be multiple choice problems. So the first thing is an attribution. All of the problems on the following pages are from the free GMAT prep software. So that is free software. You can distribute the problems as you see fit, but just make sure to, if you do pass on those problems, make sure to give an attribution. So, you know, copyright GMAT. So these are free. You can distribute them, but they are by GMAC. Okay. Remember, when you have multiple choice questions, please use these buttons to answer the questions. Please do not type your answer in the chat box. That would be unfair to other people who are in the room. Okay. Let's do this. And we're just going to go ahead and start with one of these problems and go from there. That would be, how about this one? Okay, so try this. Here's a timer for you. Go for it. Okay, everybody. So let's pick an answer, please. Remember how the GMAT works, guys. You do have to pick an answer choice. So if any of you have not picked one, then make sure you do so. Yeah. So, okay. Here are, we do have a few non-responses, but Ulysses and Vincent in particular, please pick something. Also Fabio, even if you have to guess, please pick something. Okay, here are your responses as a class. So there. So I mean, we've got a decent plurality of people picking A and E here, but let's go ahead and talk about this really quickly. First, let's talk about what is an assumption anyway. So we'll come back to this problem in a second, but let's make sure we've got our definitions straight here. So what actually is an assumption. So try in the chat box if anybody has any definitions or something like that. Suvik, that's pretty good. Anybody have anything else to contribute to that question? What is an assumption? Let's see what you guys have to say. Sometimes people dive kind of headlong into these problems without even really understanding what the task is. Make sure that's not what you're doing. Like if you have to find an assumption, make sure you know what the assumption is. Yeah, okay, these are pretty good. Let's see, statements with no valid premise. Some of these are not as good as others, but there's a couple that are especially good. But here's an example just to make sure we're on the same page. So I'm going to go ahead and blank out your answers here. Here's an example. Let's say that I give you the following silly little passage. Let's see. My friend Marco is from Italy. Therefore, Marco likes to take naps during the day. Okay, there's your argument. Simple, very short argument. So the question is, which of the following is an assumption? So I'm going to give you a couple of options here. First is people from Italy like to take naps during the day. Second assumption is people from Europe like to take naps during the day. Choice C, either of these. Go ahead and use your multiple choice options. So instead of 1, 2, 3, let's make those A, B, and C. Go ahead and pick multiple choice options for which way this is going to go. Which ones of those are assumptions? Which ones are not? Or if it's both assumptions, then pick C. So let's see what you guys have to say. Okay, we've got, only about half of you have answered this. We've got 29 people here right now, and some non-responses. Okay, let's move on here. Again, if you haven't picked anything yet, then it shouldn't really take you that long. But here are, Imran, again, please don't post your response in the chat box. Yeah, thank you. That just kind of ruins things for everyone. Okay, here's your responses. So I think most of us seem to understand what's going on here. It should be just A, but let's just make sure we discuss for those of you who didn't get this right. So what the problem, let me just be sort of brief here with this. The problem with choice B is that it doesn't have to be true. And we don't, I mean, this is only, like the only thing we're using in this argument. The only concept we're actually using to make our argument is the fact that Marco is from Italy. So what this means is two things. The first thing is we need a statement about people from Italy. But what we don't need, because it's way too general, as some of you have been pointing out, we don't need to know anything about people from the rest of Europe. So in other words, here's what's going on. Like A is something that we actually need. B is something that we do not need. I mean, that's pretty much the difference. But a lot of people are not clear on what an assumption is. And so when they're answering these problems, they're sort of going in blind. Like, let me show you what I'm talking about. Like, here's a couple of responses that people have put in the chat box that are not really good things to use as definitions. Like, some people, I mean, the problem with something like this, and I mean, a few people have been submitting things like that. It's not just this one user. But the problem with saying unstated premise is that you don't really get the idea that it has to be true. So, like, when you say this doesn't effectively express the idea that the assumption must be true. So if you just say unstated premise, then the problem is that you might think that things like B are assumptions. Because like B, if you add, see the problem is if you make B a premise, then it does work. And that's the problem. Like if you add B into the argument, then the argument works. Like Marco is from Italy, Italy's in Europe. So, you know, if all Europeans like to take naps, then Marco will like to take naps. The problem, though, is, again, we don't need to assume anything about everyone in Europe. Like, the only thing that we need for this argument to work is stuff about Italians. So that's what we've got to do. So what's better is these kinds of things that other users wrote. These are more accurate. Because these capture the essence of exactly what it is that we are after here. On which the argument depends entirely, or something that must be true. Like these are, let me disable the video here. How do I do that? Okay. We don't really use the video capability in these recordings, guys. So, thanks. All right. Suvik says if it said people take naps during the day, then not really. I mean, the argument actually doesn't say that Marco takes naps. The argument just says he likes to. So that's actually the only thing that we're talking about is whether someone would like to do so. Whether they actually do so would be an extraneous consideration. So no, that would not be an assumption. Okay, so these things capture, these two on the bottom, these definitely capture the essence of what is going on with this. So in the next slide, what we'll look at is a couple of ways that you can identify assumptions. But these capture the idea better. On the next couple of slides, before we go back to that problem, we're going to look at a couple other very simple arguments and figure out, exactly how you can identify what is being assumed. The first thing to keep in mind, by the way, is that this is not a very normal thing for people to do. Like the whole thing with assumptions is that you don't articulate them. That's actually why this is so sort of annoying of a task. Because in real life, you don't usually articulate assumptions. That's why they're assumptions, because they're not stated. I mean, they're things that are necessary, but they're things, for the most part, they're things that we just don't feel like we have to say. Or they're things that we don't say because we just kind of assume that our audience is on the same page as we are. So that's why this task is difficult, because you're being asked to articulate things that you don't normally have to articulate. So just realize that you're doing, unlike things like strengthening and weakening, which are very natural thought processes, here you got a thought process that's not very natural. You have to make explicit things that are not usually explicit. So how do you identify assumptions? Well, let's consider that issue. So two main ways if you want to do this directly. So how can we identify assumptions? Remember, this is a bigger challenge than you might think, because remember, assumptions are not there. So identifying them may be more of an issue than you might think. So, because they're not in the argument. Like, there's no voodoo magic that you can do to the argument that will just spit out an assumption, which is the whole point. Right? So here is that argument from the previous page. So here you probably just looked at this and said, oh, hey, something is missing. You know, I started with from Italy, and I finished with likes to take naps during the day. And so what you probably asked yourself is, whoa, buddy, how'd you get from there to there? So the first way to identify an assumption pretty reliably is if there is an obvious hole in the argument. So if there is a clear hole or jump in the argument, then you need an assumption to fill that hole. So here the hole or jump, you know, or to straddle the jump. Like here, this argument just kind of goes without any justification from this person is from Italy to he likes to take naps during the day. And that's just a random jump. So we do need to fill in that hole with something that gets us, that allows us to make that jump. So that's the assumption that we need. The other kind of thing may be, it's a little bit different as far as thought process goes. So here's another argument. Let's say you had something like, how about something like this? My brother bought a pair of shoes yesterday in size 13. He usually wears size 11, so he bought the wrong size. So in this case, you would probably not proceed by directly looking for a hole in the argument. Instead, what you could look for here would be how could you challenge this argument? So let's consider that issue for a second. How could you challenge this argument? Does anybody have any way? Aha, yeah, what if? So here are a couple of possible challenges. I mean, if size 13 is big, then that's not a challenge. I mean, that's actually exactly what the argument says. Aha, what if he buys for someone else? Exactly. So one challenge would be like, what if he bought a brand that runs really small? Like, you know, actually I wear a size 16 in some brands and 14 in other brands, so that's definitely a possibility. Another thing might be, what if he bought the shoes for someone else? Etc. So these are possible challenges. There are probably others, but the point is that you can come up with ways to, oh yeah, what if he's still growing? And that also works. What if he is still growing and wants to buy a pair that he can grow into? So, etc. Or even like, what if his usual size is actually too small? Or, you know, how about that? So the point here is that if this argument is going to work, then all of these, we have to dismiss all of these challenges, because all of these challenges will, if they are valid, then all of these challenges will basically kill the argument. So if the argument is to work, we must dispense with all of these challenges. So what that means is, well, but he bought a pair in size 13, Abhishek. So that would be, your statement here would contradict this statement. If that greater than sign is supposed to mean greater than. So we have to dispense with these challenges. We have to get rid of them. We have to prove that they are not really challenges. So for every challenge that you can conceive of, there has to be some sort of assumption that gets rid of it. So each challenge must be countered by an assumption. Because that's the only way to really, that's the only way to say that these challenges are not valid is, oh, we were just assuming that they weren't. So for example, what if he bought a brand that runs small? So let's talk about what kinds of assumptions have to be made here. Well, if he bought a brand that runs small, then the argument won't work. So what assumptions? Challenges are like these, and then each challenge has to give rise to some sort of assumption that's necessary. So one possible assumption would be he didn't buy, like this, the brand he bought doesn't run smaller than other brands than his usual brands. So there's that. Let me resize the text so that it'll actually fit. I mean, this assumption you would probably not come up with directly, like in number 1 up there, like with Marco and being from Italy. Like you probably wouldn't think of this directly, but you can challenge the argument without too much trouble. What if he bought the shoes for someone else? So you have to assume that he bought the shoes for himself. What if he is still growing and wants to buy a pair that he can grow into? He is done growing and or is not considering growth when buying shoes. So these are all necessary assumptions. So you could also do that, but actually this is not really a relevant issue because let's talk about that real quick. This is not a challenge because you got to stay focused on the way the argument works. This is not a challenge because the argument is my brother bought the wrong size of shoe. Like if this is true, then he still actually bought the wrong size. So this is not actually a challenge to the argument at all. I mean, this might provide a reason why he would buy the wrong size, but this does not challenge the idea that he bought the wrong size. So this is not an objection. This might help us understand his line of reasoning, but it is not a challenge. Make sure you stay focused on the issue at hand. The issue is he bought the wrong size. Like notice the difference. All of these things are actually reasons why the size would not be wrong. So, if the brand runs 2 sizes small, then a size 13 would be the right size. If he bought for someone else, size 13 could be the right size. If he's still growing, then size 13 might be the right size. If this is true, it's still the wrong size, so we don't care. All right, let's make sure we're all on the same page here. So the other way to find assumptions then is if there is a clear challenge, to the argument, then you need an assumption to dismiss or counter that challenge. So that's what we're dealing with here. So we need, if there's a clear hole, then you have to straddle it. And if there's a clear challenge, you have to dismiss it. Those are our two main ways to directly identify assumptions. So, all right, smiley face if these things make sense to you guys. And again, I notice what's not happening. Again, please don't put the smiley face in the chat box. Please use the icons that are underneath your name. The one thing that you will not see in this discussion is like templates or rules or formulas that you can memorize. Okay, just make sure you don't let your thoughts go in that particular direction, because that's not really going to help anybody. I mean, it's much easier to just think using your normal thought processes about these kinds of issues. So here's the problem that we looked at. So when you approach an argument, this is any passage really for critical reasoning, two things that you should do. The first thing that you should do is you should personalize the argument. What that means is, like basically pretend it's a conversation. It helps, it sounds a little bit weird and kooky at first to hear this, but it helps to give the speaker an actual name. Because we're human beings and we don't think like computers. So for example, if you say, what's the conclusion of the argument versus like, what is Sarah's point? Like those sound like they are, I mean, those are objectively the same question. Like someone's point would be the conclusion of their argument, but still it's much easier for human beings to answer a question like what is Sarah's point than it is to answer a question like what is the conclusion, because we're people. It's easier to think that way. The other thing that you should do is put the argument into your own words to help comprehension. Like as long as the argument is still in someone else's words, then that means the comprehension is not really there. It means you don't fully understand what it says. But if you put it into your own words, then that'll help you a lot here. Imran says basically what I do is take the statement as given and don't make any assumptions. I mean, you should always take statements the way that they're written. So I mean, I'm not really sure where you're going with that, but I mean, on one level, yes, that's true, but in a sort of trivial kind of way. But with assumptions, remember what we're doing here in the first place is finding assumptions. So be careful with that. Okay, so in my own words, and I remember that you should be doing this as well, but in my own words, what's going on in this argument is basically this. Higher levels of vitamins equals better lung function. So the amount of, as measured by blah, 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 is just kind of junk that we don't really need. So one thing it says is, so in my own words, one thing they say is more vitamins equals better lungs. And then we know that smokers have worse lungs than non-smokers. And so the argument says one way for smokers to improve is to take in more vitamins and minerals. So therefore, if the smokers take in extra vitamins and minerals, their lungs will get better. I mean, this is, and I mean, you should do this in your own words as well. Not in my words, not in their words. And I mean, you don't have to necessarily write this stuff down on paper. Like, if you do take notes on the argument, which by no means do you have to take notes on the argument, but if you do, then this is approximately what your notes should be there for, is to translate the argument into words that are your own. But the point is to get somewhere, because this is probably a lot easier to understand than the words that are originally up there. So, I mean, as far as finding holes, there doesn't really seem to be much here in the way of holes, right? So to find an assumption, you could, number one, you could try to fill in a hole in the argument. Or number two, you could try to challenge the argument and then specify an assumption to dismiss that challenge. So, I mean, as far as number one goes here, there doesn't really seem to be a ton of holes in this argument because, I mean, if you think about it, this is pretty solid in terms of pure logic. Like, if you make vitamins go up, then lungs will be better, so hey, why not? There doesn't really seem to be a lot of holes here. What about challenging the argument? Does anybody see any challenges that they can level against this argument right here? If so, what? So someone says cancer, although we don't know anything about the effect of cancer in the argument. So you don't really want to go there because you can't introduce additional unknowns. So yeah, like, okay, what Suvik says is pretty much the idea. Like, what if, because the things have to be in the bloodstream, but we're just talking about like eating more of them. And so one possible challenge that you can level against this argument is what if like those things don't get into the bloodstream? Like, what if the problem with smokers is that the vitamins don't make it to the bloodstream in the first place? And that's one possible challenge that you could level here is, because right now we're saying, oh, you should just eat more vitamins and then smile. But the problem is if the vitamins themselves aren't, like if the problem is not the intake of vitamins, but rather the fact that the vitamins are not getting where they're supposed to go, then that's going to be a very valid challenge. So what we need there is an assumption that will counter the challenge. So that's a valid challenge, so we need to assume that that's not the case. Like, nothing gets in the way of smokers' absorption of vitamins into the bloodstream. So that corresponds to choice E. And so choice E is the choice that we want. So if you have any questions about that answer choice, then you can post those. In the meantime, let's discuss this issue that Suvik has posted. Suvik, let me know if I'm actually saying your name correctly. Suvik. I'm not real confident I'm saying that right. But let's see. Hardly matters. No, it matters to me. I mean, my name is not very hard to pronounce, but it would sort of annoy me if somebody was saying it wrong. Okay, so here's a question that Suvik asks. And it's a good one. I mean, it's kind of like, how should I orient myself to this task in general here? What do you guys think of this? Should we come up with an answer before we read the answer choices? Let's go ahead and take this onto the next page and discuss it there. So this is a pretty good answer that I want to say it's pronounced Saket has given. This is actually pretty good. Let me elaborate on this a little bit. The basic idea is the one sort of thing that I'm going to articulate more explicitly here than Saket does is my answer to this question would be yes, if you can. Because, I mean, remember, again, what we said about the task at hand here. I mean, remember what you are trying to do. I mean, ultimately, as weird as it sounds, you are trying to come up with something that is not actually there. So, like, in some cases, you'll be able to do that easily enough. Like, in the case of the shoe size argument, you guys had no trouble coming up with a bunch of challenges. But in some cases, the challenges will not be as easy to come up with. I mean, it's not really realistic to expect that you would be able to find the assumption just on your own at random every single time. So the answer is yes, if you can. And then if you can't really, then you just take the opposite approach and start going through the choices. But I think it's a good idea to see whether you can do one of those two things we talked about first, whether you can challenge it or just come up with a whole. So if not, then go through the choices. And there's one more thing you can do with the choices, which we're going to talk about actually at the present moment. So let's talk about what else you can do. So finding assumptions, we did talk about this. We did talk about a clear whole or jump in the argument or a challenge. So let's condense that here on the next page. And okay, so identifying assumptions directly. There's two ways to do that, like we talked about. Number one, find a whole and fill it in. Or number two, find a challenge and then dismiss it. On the other hand, again, you won't necessarily be able to do these things all the time. Like sometimes you will genuinely need answer choices. So like let's say these things don't work. So then if they don't work, that's where you want to start using answer choices. So let's talk about how you would want to do that. So, I mean, let's return to the basic notion of what an assumption is. And then we're going to derive how you should do this. So remember, assumptions are necessary. Okay, what does necessary mean? I mean, this sounds really kind of stupid, but let's take a shot at it. And I mean, don't give me a synonym for necessary. So like when I say what does necessary mean, don't give me like needed or required or compulsory or anything like that. Like actually give me, can anybody come at necessary from a different angle? Like what does it mean to be necessary? Again, if it sounds like a dumb question, then humor me here. What does it mean for something to be necessary? Like, think about what it means. Yeah. Like, think about what it means that water is necessary to stay alive as a human. I mean, that means if you don't get water, then you die. So, what that means in terms of assumptions is that if the assumption is not true, if you don't have the water, then you die. If the assumption is false, then the argument dies. So this would normally just be a cute fact about assumptions. But what makes it more than just a cute fact is that you have answer choices. And using the answer choices, you can actually take them and make them false and see what the effect is. So that's what I'm going to call, I mean, you might hear it variously referred to as like negation technique or reversal method or whatever. I'm going to go ahead and call it reversal method. Because what this does is you just basically you just use this fact. you make the assumption false, and then see if it destroys the argument. So if the argument is destroyed, then you have found an assumption. So, like, let's take the argument about my brother and his shoe size, that sort of thing. And then let's take the assumptions that we got and talk about the reversal method here. So here's that. The argument there was this. Just to remind you, my brother bought a pair of shoes in size 13. He usually wears size 11, so he bought the wrong size. So let's take these assumptions that we came up with. Let's make it false. Let's make them false. And then let's see what effect that has on the argument. So here's an assumption. So if we make this false, we get he bought a brand that runs significantly smaller than his usual brands. So if this is true, then it destroys the argument because he could have bought the correct size in this brand. Another assumption that we made was he bought the shoes for himself. If we make that assumption, if we make that false, we get he bought the shoes for someone else, in which case absolutely any size could be the correct size. Because, I mean, we don't know who he bought them for now. And then finally, there's another correct assumption, which is he is done growing or is not considering growth when buying shoes. So if you make that false, you get he's not done growing and is considering growth in his purchases. So again, this also destroys the argument because then that would be, okay, maybe not wrong size. So any of these things, if you reverse them, the argument gets destroyed. So that's how this works. So it's a good backup. The reason why this is such a powerful method is that suddenly you are not doing like an unfamiliar, weird thing anymore. Because remember, finding assumptions directly at the end of the day is weird. It's a very strange thing to do. Because again, assumptions are not things that we normally call out in specifics. That's why they're assumptions, because we don't. But when you do this reversal method, you're not actually finding an assumption anymore. And when you do this reversal method, the task now becomes just taking a statement, which is, you know, the reversal statement, and just seeing whether it makes the argument stronger or weaker or gets destroyed. And that's a very natural thought process. Like, that is not a weird thought process at all. So it takes, the strength of this reversal method is that it takes something that is very weird, i.e. calling out assumptions directly, and it turns it into something that is not weird, i.e. just seeing if an argument is destroyed. I mean, that we do in real life all the time. So that's the power of this here. So we're going to do a new problem here in a second, but let's go ahead and go back to the problem about smokers, and let's use the reversal method. So here's the smoker problem, kind of out of space on that page. So here's another page. Let's just use the reversal method on the correct answer. On choice E. So if this is a very nice choice to reverse. I mean, because, you know, ladies and gentlemen, it has the words does not into it. So reversing that is very easy to do. Like, all we have to do is change does not to does. Does introduce chemicals that prevent the vitamins from making it into the bloodstream. So if this is true, then this definitely destroys the argument. Because if this is true, then eating more food with those vitamins will not address the problem. Because then, I mean, those chemicals are still there. So even if you take mega doses of vitamins, they still won't make it into your blood. So lots of things we can do here. So just quick summary is what's on this page. If you can directly identify the assumption by one of these two ways, then by all means, you should do that. Find a hole, fill it in, or find a challenge and dismiss it. If you can't do either of those, or if you have trouble coming up with something cold, then don't come up with something cold. Instead, use the answer choices, reverse them, and see if any of those reversals destroy the argument. Any questions? If not, we'll move on to another problem. Okay, let's look at this one. How about that? Okay, here is a timer. Let's look at it. Prashant, the answer to all questions about what level was the problem is you do not care. Just learn to address the task that is in front of you, and it doesn't matter what the difficulty level is, because the ways that you address that are the same no matter what. All right, here's a timer. Have fun. Okay, we still have quite a number of non-responses here, so if you have to guess, please guess. Take about 15 seconds if you need to. Okay, let's talk about it. So we have, there are still lots of people who haven't answered this problem, so that may skew the results here a little bit. But of those of you who did answer it, the results are quite good. So we have a very strong majority in favor of E. But again, we have 4 non-responses. So actually 3, because one of those is me. Those 3 might, they might change the statistics a little bit. But yes, the one that almost all of you guys picked is indeed the correct answer. So let's go ahead and look at it. It doesn't really seem like we'll have to spend too much time on it because the performance was quite good. But let's check it out. So in my own words, remember that that's the key step here. You should take this and make it, you got to own the passage. You got to make it yours. So the deal here is that we're talking about having to import food. So we don't really care about things like per capita income at the end of the day, except in as much as they affect food. So narrowly self-sufficient is right now Gortland produces just enough grain and meat for its people. That's what narrowly this is why it's so important to put this stuff in your own words, because like narrowly self-sufficient is kind of mumbo jumbo, whereas produces just enough stuff for its people is definitely not mumbo jumbo. That's a very easy statement to understand. So people are getting richer, and so they are eating more meat. So people in the country are eating more meat since they have more money. And it takes, like, basically, it takes several pounds of grain to make 1 pound of meat, which means that, you know, meat is a more intensive thing to grow. So, like, meat basically takes more resources than grain does. So that's the point here. And so the argument says, because of this, that because they're not going to make any more grain, and so they're soon going to have to import stuff. So therefore, Gordland will have to start importing food. So, okay, remember what you want to try to do here if it's at all possible. The first thing you want to try to do is find assumptions directly. So if you can, then let's try that. So find a hole and fill it in, or find a challenge and then dismiss it. As far as finding a hole, again, I don't really see one, because this is pretty solid logic. Like, right now we have just enough food for the people, so if the people start needing more food, then guess what? So the logic here, I don't really see any obvious holes. Because, you know, this is pretty solid reasoning as far as the stuff that's actually mentioned. So what about a possible challenge to the argument? How would you do that? And when you come up with challenges here, also make sure that you are not being unrealistically optimistic. Well, what I mean by that is when you have answer choices in front of you, and especially once you've like seen the problem and you kind of know which choice is the correct answer, it's very easy to, like, in retrospect, look back and say, oh yeah, that's the challenge. But when you talk about challenging the argument, make sure that you are coming up with challenges that could reasonably be things that you would come up with on your own. So that's the key thing here. Like, you have to have challenges that you might reasonably invent. So what if, okay, let's talk about this. What if groundbreaking technology helps farmers to produce more grains? What do you guys think of that? Is that a valid challenge to this argument? If not, then why not? I mean, that seems to be a challenge, but it's not. Because the passage says that it's not. So, I mean, that's not really something that you can, I mean, you can't contradict the actual passage. So, just make sure you realize that. Domestic grain production will not increase, says the passage. I mean, the concept here is that the passage is not kidding. What I mean by that is whatever you do, challenges or weakeners or whatever it is in any kind of credit, I mean, you can never reason as though the passage is lying. Like, if it says something, then whatever's in there you should take as true. If it's stated as a fact. Not claims. I mean, in other words, things stated as facts. If they draw conclusions from those facts, then you can challenge those, which is actually the whole point of what we're trying to do right now. But the things that they state as facts, you cannot argue with. So about facts, the passage is not kidding. Just make sure you know that. So, what if, so the thing is that people, like, one thing you might come up with as a challenge is, because people don't just, like, eat more of everything. Like, unless they're on those reality television shows that are all about, people who weigh 600 pounds. But except for those people, like if you eat more of one thing, then you probably are going to start eating less of another thing. So one challenge that you might reasonably come up with here would be, like, well, what if they, if they eat lots more meat, what if they eat less grain accordingly? Because right now the argument seems to be like assuming that people will eat more meat and still keep eating just as much grain as they currently are. So what we need there is an assumption that they won't cut back. People won't cut back their consumption of grain. And that corresponds to choice E. So there's that. You could also, Abhishek, that would also work, but you would need to actually be a little bit more exact about what that level is. In other words, you would have to say at about the level where Gortland is. That's where that correspondence stops. If they said that, that would also be a challenge. What about this that Ulysses says? Does anybody have any comments about this one? Is that a challenge? What do you guys think? What if they import more grain to produce their own meat, says Ulysses? Is that a challenge? Yeah, that's definitely not a challenge. I mean, in fact, that's exactly what the argument is saying, is that they will have to import stuff. So if you're saying that, you are actually completely agreeing with the argument and you're not challenging anything. So, I mean, this is why, you need to make sure that you at least have this focus on what the argument says. Like that right there is exactly, this is not a challenge. This is the argument. So not a challenge at all. If you gave me that as a challenge, what that means what that probably means you're not doing is you're not doing this. Like you're not putting the argument into your own words. Because if you were, then if you had that kind of mental understanding of the argument, then you would realize that there is something very wrong with that. As in, you're not challenging at all. So, but what if people eat less meat is, the whole argument is about people eating more meat. So you don't want to just go against everything that's happening in the argument. Again, the argument's not kidding. Okay, the other thing that you can do is, again, if you have to, you can use this reversal method. So let's use that here. Again, most of you picked the right answer here, so unless someone has, if you have specific questions about one of the wrong answers, then feel free, but otherwise. So E, if you reverse this, you get people in this country who eat more meat will radically decrease their consumption of grain, will eat much less grain. So if this is true, then it destroys the argument because it lends this idea that there's going to be a balance, and they'll need to make more meat, but they can afford to make less grain correspondingly. So that actually is something that destroys the argument when you reverse it. Any questions about this problemo? If not, we'll move on to another one. Let's move on to another one. How about, let's see. How about something like this one? Try this. Again, you guys know where to get answer choices from. Should get them from here. Let me give you a timer. Have a good time. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have about 4 or 5 non-responses. So if you are one of the non-responses, then please pick something. Thank you. Okay. I need to take care of something that will take about 20 seconds. So take 20 more seconds to pick your answer if necessary. Okay, that took less than 20 seconds. All right, so here are your responses as a group. So we got a strong majority here, but there's still some, decent segments of people picking other choices. So let's take a look. What's the argument here in the first place? This is one of the few where, because it takes place in the context of a conversation, you have to, it's not as explicit as it always is in most other things. Like, because it's a conversation, you're expected to pick up on the dynamics more than otherwise. So, like, what is, we want to talk about Sharon's argument at the end of the day. So what is Sharon's argument? Yeah, Sharon thinks that it's not weird. That's a pretty good way to summarize. And if you have trouble figuring that out, I think the best diagnosis there is that you're probably not really thinking of it. Because if you're thinking of this as a conversation, then it's probably not that hard to figure this out. But if you do have trouble knowing what Sharon is arguing, then just think about the words that would clue you in like a normal conversation. Like, for instance, Roland says this thing is alarming, but Sharon says but. So then very likely. So we're saying that's what's going on here. So just make sure you can follow with that sort of thing. So yes. All right, so that's the argument that Sharon is trying to make, is this is not really very weird after all, ladies and gentlemen. So, why is that not weird? So, well, her argument, again, you want to put it into your own words just to conserve time a little bit. Here's my own words. So, Roland says that Roland basically just says almost everyone knows an unemployed person. Whoa. Sharon says, well, the overall percentage of unemployment is high enough that we would expect on average that people would know someone or even several someones who is or are unemployed. So not whoa. That's basically the point. So as far as, again, finding a hole in the argument, there's, you could maybe, you might actually maybe be able to find a hole in the argument in this case. If you are keen on what they do in these passages about averages and statistics and such things. Like this is, I mean, they don't say average, but it's pretty clear that this is a like national average. So can you find a hole? Maybe if you kind of are, if you're down with what they do with statistics here, then you can find a hole here. So the hole here is that Sharon treats an overall average as though it applies to every individual. I mean, this is always a very dangerous thing to do with averages. You know, I mean, if the average American eats like 2,800 calories a day, that doesn't mean that every single American eats 2,800 calories a day. So the same thing is true here. Like Sharon's basically saying that if you know that no matter who knows the 50 people that like, you know, 50 is not a lot, by the way. I would think you would know more than 50 people, but whatever. So like the point is no matter who those 50 people are, Sharon is saying that regardless of who they are, that's still the same percent of them are going to be unemployed. So we need an assumption that does that. We must assume that like the overall average actually applies across the board. That's the same as saying that there are not, you know, significant distortions in the average. So equivalently, there is not large variation. There's not a large amount of variation around the average. It's the same thing. Like if you can apply an average to everyone, that means there's very little variation no matter where you go. So that does correspond to choice B. Or, you know, if you challenge the argument, it's very much the same. So the challenge here is, hey, Sharon, what if that average doesn't apply to everyone? And then once you figure out that that's a challenge, then you will, to defeat that challenge or to dismiss it, you need to have one of those. Finally, if it comes down to it, you can use the reversal method here. So if we take choice B and we reverse it, then what it winds up saying is that unemployment is, right now it says unemployment is not, again, it's very nice to have that word not in there like that. Unemployment is not normally concentrated in geographically isolated segments. So if you reverse this, we get unemployment is normally concentrated in some very specific places. Again, I don't love statements like geographically isolated segments or whatever they say, because that's not, to my brain, that doesn't mean anything when I first see it. But if I change that in my head to some very specific places, then oh, hey, wow, that makes a lot more sense to me now. So, just FYI. Does multiple, Sharon does say if they know 50 workers. Abhishek, that's not really how they're going to roll, because they want people to be, I guess, more perceptive about statistics than that. So I don't think they're going to, I don't think they're going to do something as easy as challenging the idea that someone knows 50 workers. Would that be a challenge if they did that? Sure, it would. But there's two reasons why I think they're not going to go there. The first is that that's just not very perceptive for the most part. It's kind of just on the surface. But also think about the assumption that you would need to counter that. The assumption you would need is that people really know 50 people, and that's basically what Sharon is already saying. So it's basically the whole concept of the passage isn't kidding again. It's not exactly the same because she does say if. And so what that means is that there's still, there is some shadow of a doubt there. But it's more that they're not going to do it just because it's not really, it's not substantial enough. The last thing I want to point out before we leave here is let's take a look at the different correct assumptions that we saw here in these problems. So here's the one about smoking. Notice that this says smoking does not introduce. That's one of them. The next problem we saw was this thing about Gortland. And the correct assumption here was, again, about what people will not do. And the last problem we saw was this one. And again, our correct assumption is about something that people don't do, or something that is not true. So what we want to notice here is, notice that pattern. Like every single correct assumption in these problems was about what people don't do. So one thing that you can notice is that in assumption problems is that not all of them, but a large number, many assumptions are concerned with what people don't do or with what isn't true or with what won't happen. If you think about this, if you think about the procedures that we talked about up there, this should actually make perfect sense. Because remember that most assumptions are like dismissals of things that might happen. So this is kind of a natural consequence of that. This should make perfect sense. Makes sense. Because remember, many, if not most, assumptions are dismissals of possible challenges. So, like, in other words, challenges of things that might happen, and then you have an assumption that says it doesn't. Even in a really basic argument. Like, for example, I don't know, it usually takes 5.5 hours to drive to LA from where I live. So if I have an argument that's like, if I get in my car now and leave for LA, I will get there in 5.5 hours. Think about all the assumptions you have to make about not and not and not. Like, okay, what if you crash your car? You have to assume that I will not crash my car. What if you run out of gas? You'll have to assume that I will not run out of gas. What if your car breaks down? You have to assume that my car will not break down. What if aliens abduct me off the freeway? Well, you have to assume that aliens will not abduct me off the freeway. In other words, there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of assumptions that have not in them. There are always a couple that don't. Like, you also have to assume that I have a car to drive and that I have enough money for gas. But most assumptions you're going to see are going to be dismissals of ideas, and so most of them are going to be negative statements. So, in other words, the trend that you're going to see is that lots of correct assumptions. In fact, most in the case of GMAT, CREP, and OG. And so we can surmise probably the test itself are negative statements. In other words, statements about what won't happen, or what people won't do, or what isn't true. So if you have to guess, these make an awfully good guess, is the point. If you're really lost on an assumption problem, then you should preferentially guess negative statements as assumptions. Because proportionally, I mean, is this going to give you the right answer every time? No, of course it won't. But if you have to guess, then those are good guesses. And then reversal method, you know, this question, this also ties in. Let me delete the part that doesn't matter here. Ron, it seems that the reversal method is more effective. I mean, also note that negative statements are also much easier to reverse. So, I mean, you can, even if you're starting with the reversal method, these are also a good place to begin. But this is a good guessing method. Is it perfect? It's not perfect, just like any other guessing method. It's a guessing method. So at the end of the day, no, it will not be perfect. But if you do guess negative statements at random, then you will do a lot better than you would if you guessed non-negative statements at random. So it's a numbers game. All right, we are out of time, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to close up shop here. If you have any questions that are administrative in nature, like, you know, business questions or things like that, then ask those now. This is not the time to submit topics. In case anybody was going to go there, please don't go there. But if you have any administrative type questions, you can very quickly ask those at this point. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up, call it a day, and good night, and good luck. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording.